The longer you operate as a solopreneur, the smaller your goals can quietly become, even when everything else is going reasonably well. Not because you've gotten less capable, not because the market has humbled you into realism, because of a specific thing that isolation does to the cognitive process that sets your ambition ceiling. Most solopreneurs who've been on this path for 3 or more years have felt some version of this, even if they haven't said it out loud. The projects that once excited them feel a little out of reach now. The goals they set feel more conservative than they used to. And somewhere underneath the day-to-day of actually running the business, there's a quiet question they don't fully engage with. When did I stop wanting that? This video is about the specific mechanism behind that pattern, not a motivation problem, not a mindset problem, a structural one with a structural explanation. Here's what the contraction actually looks like in practice. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a crisis or a dramatic loss of drive. It looks like reasonable decisions. It looks like pitching a scope of work that's slightly smaller than what you would have pitched 2 years ago, and calling it setting expectations appropriately. It looks like looking at an idea that would have energized you in year 1 and spending less than 30 seconds before filing it under not realistic right now. It looks like a revenue target that stopped climbing, not because you hit a ceiling, but because you quietly stopped raising it. None of these feel like giving up. That's what makes the contraction so hard to see from inside it. Every adjustment feels like the mature version of ambition. Every smaller goal feels like the earned wisdom of someone who has been doing this long enough to know what's achievable. And maybe that framing is partly right. Some of what looks like contraction is genuinely calibration. A solopreneur who stopped chasing the wrong things is not a solopreneur in decline. But here's the distinction that matters. There's a version of realistic that comes from accumulating real experience and making smarter bets with it. And there's a version of realistic that comes from operating without anyone in your professional life who holds a vision for what you're capable of that matches or exceeds your own. Those two versions feel identical from the inside. That's the problem, because the first one sharpens you, and the second one quietly shrinks you and hands you a rationale that sounds exactly like wisdom. Research on aspiration setting is consistent on this point. The level of ambition a person maintains is not purely an internal resource they draw on. It's calibrated constantly against the people around them. What those people are attempting, what they believe is possible, what ceiling they're operating under. When that reference pool narrows to 1, the calibration process doesn't stop, it just runs on silence. So here's the specific thing that happens, and why it matters more than most solopreneurs realize. Ambition is not a fixed internal resource. It's not something you have a set amount of that depletes or refills based on how motivated you feel on a given morning. It's a socially calibrated process, which means it is shaped continuously, invisibly, automatically by the performance goals and aspirations of the people you observe most closely. Research on peer effects and goal setting has documented this directly. When people observe peers setting goals higher than their own, they revise their own goals upward. When they observe peers operating with lower targets, they revise downward. The effect isn't minor, and it doesn't require deliberate comparison. The calibration happens whether you're thinking about it or not. Now consider what this means for someone who has been operating entirely alone for 2, 3, 4 years. The reference pool has collapsed. The people you observe most closely are your clients, who you are not in peer relationship with. They're the content you consume, which is either aspirational in a way that activates comparison anxiety, or tactical in a way that doesn't touch the ambition question at all. And they're yourself, one person, running the calibration process on a sample size of 1. Here's what that produces over time. The aspiration horizon, the outer edge of what feels genuinely possible, slowly contracts toward what's immediately visible, not toward what you're capable of, toward what's in front of you, confirmed, legible, and achievable without friction. This is what the realism narrative is doing. When a solopreneur says, "I'm just being more realistic now," they're often describing the output of a calibration process that has been running without adequate inputs. The realism isn't wrong, exactly. It's just that it has been generated in conditions that systematically produce underestimation, because there's no one to pull the ceiling back up when it drifts. The insidious part is that the contraction is gradual. You don't lose 20% of your ambition in a week. You lose it in fractions of a percent, across hundreds of small decisions, each of which feels completely rational in isolation. And because there's no external reference point, because there's no one who knew what you were going for in year 1 and can see what you're going for now, the drift is essentially undetectable from inside the experience. Until the day you look at an old plan, or an old pitch, or a note you wrote to yourself when you were starting and you think, I used to want that. That moment, when you encounter evidence of the earlier version of your ambition, is one of the more specific and under-examined emotional experiences of long-term solo operation. Because it doesn't just feel like a productivity observation, it feels like an identity question. Not, why are my goals smaller, but what happened to the person who wanted the larger thing? And that's where the stakes of this become real. Because the contraction isn't just about revenue targets or project scope. It's about the self-concept of being someone who builds big things. The solopreneur who went solo, in many cases, did so precisely because they believed they were capable of something significant. That belief was the foundation of the decision. And when the ambition quietly recedes, when the goals get safer, the ideas get smaller. The sense of what's possible gets domesticated by years of operating in a reference pool of one. It doesn't read as a structural consequence. It reads as evidence that the self-concept was wrong. That the person who believed they could build something significant was the naive version. And the quieter, more conservative, more realistic version is just who they actually are. Here's the honest version of what's actually happening. The ambition didn't leave. The calibration system lost its inputs. Those are not the same thing. One is a verdict about capability. The other is a structural consequence of an operating condition. And the distinction between those two framings changes something real. Not just emotionally, but operationally. Because if it's a verdict, the response is acceptance or denial. But if it's a structural consequence, the response is changing the structure. Research on how peer environments shape goal setting makes the recovery mechanism equally clear. The same calibration process that produced the contraction can produce the expansion when the reference pool changes. When you begin operating in proximity to people who are attempting things at or above your actual capability level, who hold a vision for what's possible that isn't bounded by your current caution, who push back on the realistic framing with their own evidence, the ceiling moves, not because they motivated you, because the calibration system received new inputs, and it updated. That's not a soft claim about the power of positive community. That's a description of how ambition actually functions as a cognitive and social process, and what it requires to function well. If this is the work you want to do, restoring the calibration system, not just understanding why it drifted, there's a 90-day structured experience in the description built specifically for this. Small cohort, weekly peer-level sessions. The kind of sustained contact with people operating at your level that the mechanism actually requires. The link is in the description and pinned in the comments. Now, before this video closes, here's the specific move that actually begins to change this. Not think bigger, not a vision board, not a motivational system. Those operate on the assumption that ambition is an internal resource you can top up with the right content. The mechanism says otherwise. The move is to change who you observe, not who you follow online, not whose podcast you listen to, who you observe operating in real time at peer level with stakes that are legible to you because they're close to your own. There's an important distinction here. The wrong reference pool can actually accelerate the contraction. A community where people are performing success, where the stated goals are always enormous, but the operational reality of how anyone gets there is invisible, doesn't give the calibration system useful inputs. It gives it noise. Comparison anxiety dressed as inspiration. What the calibration system actually needs is contact with people who are attempting things that are a credible stretch above your current operating level, not a fantasy level, not a performance level, and who are doing it transparently enough that you can see what the attempt actually costs and requires. That specificity matters. Because a lot of solopreneurs who've tried peer groups before walked away with the correct instinct that something was off, and the wrong conclusion that the format itself was broken. What was broken was the match. The reference pool was either too distant to be useful or too curated to be honest. What high-functioning solo operators actually do, the ones who sustain their ambition across a decade on this path, is not wait to feel ambitious again. They build the conditions in which ambition recalibrates naturally. They find one or two people, at roughly their level, operating transparently enough to function as a genuine reference point, and they build that contact into the operating structure of the business. Not as a social activity, but as a functional one. The question worth sitting with before this video closes is this. Who in your professional world currently holds a vision for what you're capable of that is at least as large as your own? If the answer is no one, that's not a motivation problem. That's a structural gap. And structural gaps have structural solutions. If the 90-day cohort in the description is the right next step for where you are, the link is there in the description and pinned in the comments. It's built for exactly the operating condition this video describes. When did you first notice your ambition getting quieter? And what did you tell yourself it was? Let's close with what's actually true. Going solo was not a mistake. The fact that the path has a cost, a specific, structural, measurable cost, does not make the path wrong. It makes it honest. The cost here is real. Operating without people who hold a large vision for you, who challenge the ceiling you've quietly installed, who make ambitious thinking feel possible, again, not through cheerleading but through proximity. That absence does something. It contracts the aspiration horizon in ways that feel like wisdom until you notice that the wisdom keeps pointing in the same direction. Smaller, safer, less exposed. That's not you. That's the calibration system running on insufficient inputs. And here's why that distinction matters more than it might seem. The solopreneur who accepts the contraction as a verdict adjusts to it. They make peace with the smaller targets. They reframe the reduced ambition as maturity. And they continue operating, capable and experienced, below what they could have built. The solopreneur who understands it as a structural consequence does something different. They don't try harder. They don't consume more motivational content. They change the structure. They find one person, or two, or a small cohort who are operating at the level that makes the ceiling move. And they build that contact into the way they work, the way they plan, the way they decide what's worth attempting. The ambition you had when you started this, the version of what you wanted to build that felt urgent and real and worth the cost, that didn't leave because you got realistic. It got quiet because the calibration system stopped receiving the inputs it needs. Give it new inputs, not because you owe it to anyone, because you chose this path because you believed you were capable of building something significant. And you were right, one move at a time.